Hello everybody, hello friends, it is me, Deep in the Reeds, and I'm back to talk about another book that has to do with food, I guess. The last book I talked about examined the social aspects of fast food. This book also, I guess, deals with food, although in a completely different sense. It's about the extreme lack of food and the world's greatest famine, which resulted in tens of millions of deaths under a horrifically tyrannical government. So won't that be fun? The book is, of course, Mao's Great Famine, The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe by Frank Dikötter. Mao's Great Famine is the first installment, came out in 2010, of what became a three-part series on China under communism, starting from the takeover of the country in 1949 to the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976. The famine that the book is referring to is it was supposed to be the Great Leap Forward, that's what Mao called it, where his goal was to transform China into an agricultural and industrial superpower and an economic competitor on the world stage. The Great Leap Forward was supposed to last 15 years, but they only made it 4 years before politicians like Liu Shaoqi were able to talk Mao Zedong down from the precipice and reverse his trajectory. But in the meantime, tens of millions of people ended up dying, and the dream of realizing a communist utopia where everybody walked around with big creepy smiles on their faces was not realized, and the country descended into absolute hell. Now, as you might know, the Communist Party that perpetrated the disasters of the Great Leap Forward is still in control of China, so it's often very difficult for researchers to get in and get the information they need to write fully fleshed out books. But what's special about Dikötter's research is that it's very much original to this book. He was given unprecedented access to some official party archives, and from that he was able to pull a lot of information that we didn't have before. So this book is very valuable for that reason. And with that information, he argues that the Great Leap Forward was absolutely not the result of a natural disaster, as some like to argue. He also claims that the death toll is much higher than is normally estimated. Frank Dikötter puts it at about 45 million thereabouts, which is equivalent of about 4 Holocausts. Because of the massive scale of the tragedy and the size of the events that are happening, Frank Dikötter can't really write this as a chronological narrative, and instead he has to write it according to subject matter. So the book's kind of divided roughly into the upper echelons of China and how they were perceiving the famine and how their policies were working, versus how the people on the ground were actually experiencing the Great Leap Forward. And those two sections, I guess, are divided into smaller subjects. One of my favorite parts of the book is early on, where we get to see the tensions between Mao Zedong and Khrushchev, or the tensions between China and the Soviet Union. You get a sense for the characters and the personalities at play, where Mao clearly has an inferiority complex, and he wants to be the top dog of the communist world rather than the Soviet Union. So you get to see how his ego plays into why he's so zealous about the Great Leap Forward. And then you go from there to talking about the famine itself, and that's when you just get overwhelmed with an avalanche of statistics and figures and hard facts. The book is basically a horror story told through statistics. This book was definitely written to be a reference, so it's not the most accessible thing to read cover to cover. While what you're reading is definitely interesting and gripping, and the magnitude and the stakes are very high, you often lose sight of like the humanity that's going on here. But despite all of that, it's still engaging because of just how interesting the subject matter is by itself. The funny thing about this book is that it actually kind of lulls you into a false sense of security. I mean, the first 3 parts of the book are definitely disturbing, but because they're presented through mostly statistics and figures, it doesn't quite penetrate. And then parts 4 and 5 just absolutely blindside you, and you're descended into hell so quickly that it feels like a different book almost. The author shifts from talking about statistics and things to just an endless tide of horrifying stories of what it was actually like to go through the famine. And you see the endless lengths that people will go to in order to slightly increase their chance of survival. People are selling their children. Desperate people are eating mud until their intestines clog in order to try and get some sustenance. And it's still presented in a very scattershot way where you're moving rapidly from one story to the next. But because it's just endless horror, it's like you're brought into this incredibly bleak atmosphere, and it's almost hypnotic. So you can feel it just sitting in the pit of your stomach while you're going through some of this. And I'm just going to give you a slight example of what I mean, and I apologize for the bad pronunciation. As there was not enough food to go around, the most able workers were given preferential treatment, while those considered to be idlers, like children, sick, and the elderly, were abused. The party archives are full of long and painful lists of examples. In Luding County, Guangdong, local cadre Q Ben-di beat to death an 8-year-old who had stolen a handful of rice. In Hunan, Tan Yun King, aged 12, was drowned like a puppy for having pilfered food from the canteen. Sometimes parents were forced to inflict the punishment. When a boy stole a handful of grain, local boss Zhang Shangmin forced his father to bury him alive. The father died of grief a few days later. So, needless to say, this book is absolutely not for the faint of heart. But if the sheer brutality of this book wasn't enough to keep me awake at night, there were a lot of other things that really gave me a lot to think about in this book. One of the things that stood out to me was just how wasteful everything was. It was almost as if people thought that the more suffering went into producing something, the more virtuous it was. Like, they went out of their way to make everything super inefficient. Instead of purchasing modern technology and equipment to get projects done, they would instead throw massive amounts of time and resources and money to make people use bad equipment and just work in droves to make badly produced things that fell apart anyway. And then with farming, for some reason, the upper echelons of China dictated to farmers from the top down, telling them how to make crops. And they forced them to plant crops way too close together, and they used a technique called deep plowing, which is way more labor intensive. So that yielded a double whammy where you had far fewer crops being produced for a much hungrier populace. And on top of that, the storage was terrible, so oftentimes you'd have massive quantities of food just rotting and going completely to waste. And on top of that, like a lot of other famines in history, China was exporting grain hand over fist to other countries to keep them economically competitive instead of feeding their own people, which is antithetical to communism. So Frank Dikötter uses these examples and others to illustrate that the famine was absolutely not a natural disaster. It was caused by terrible policies coming from above. And speaking of terrible policies, another thing that I noticed with this book was how control often leads to more control. For example, when China's tyrannical policies in rural areas led to people fleeing into the cities to escape the worst of the famine, that led China to, instead of addressing the problem, imposing more tyrannical policies, only this time it was aimed at restricting the movement of its own people and creating a rural underclass. So that's something I kind of have realized, is that countries with overstepping governments often don't address the problem. Instead, they just add more and more layers of control. So the thing that I took from that is that this is a great illustration of how China, as well as other so-called communist nations, constantly stray completely from anything that Karl Marx would have advocated for. Let's go down the list, shall we? Did the workers own the means of production? Absolutely not. Did the workers influence policy or the direction of the country? Hell no. Did Mao decide to do away with hierarchy? Absolutely not. So, and then one of the central tenets of Marxism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And that's a joke in Mao's China, because the absolute opposite was true. the people who had the ability often kept everything to themselves or kicked it up the chain of command, whereas the people who were needy, who couldn't work, who didn't have the ability of other people, were systematically starved out. They were considered like the dregs of society, so might as well let them starve because they can't work. So that's like so far away from anything that you would have read about in Das Kapital, which leads me to sort of a more broad point, which is that nations that often hold up these values and virtues are often very hypocritical, and they don't even try in a lot of cases to live up to the standards that they're setting for themselves, and China was no exception to that. So having said all that, the book is obviously good at provoking a lot of thought and showing you like the upper limits of insanity when it comes to tyrannical government power. But I still felt that there were a few areas where the book was a bit lacking in information. Like, I know that going into this, that the book would sort of tunnel vision on the famine itself, and that things like the history of the revolution or Mao himself would be kind of peripheral. So I was fine with that. But there were some things that I think were missing that would have painted a clearer picture had they been part of the book. The biggest one that I can think of is the carrots and sticks that sort of motivated the upper echelons of Maoist China into doing what they did. Like, I understood the threats and the incentives for the peasant class, but why is it that entire provinces were willing to let thousands, if not millions of people die just to fulfill a quota? Why was Mao in such a position to just be like, oh yeah, like, we know that he wasn't like murdering people at the higher levels who were criticizing him, so why was there this atmosphere of fear, and what were the incentives of doing what Mao wanted? Like, they didn't seem to really get anything out of it. So basically that's a major factor in why the famine played out how it did, and I feel like it's kind of missing. I also wish that Dikötter had gone into more detail on things like the Four Pests campaign, which, based on my reading on Wikipedia, is definitely the most insane aspect of the famine. And then the other thing is, I wish there had been more interviews included. Like, there were a few, but I really feel that he should have pulled on them more reliably than he did in order to keep the reader in focus of the human element of the story. But overall, you get a lot of information out of this book. It's very dense, and the subject matter is so interesting to me, so it wasn't like a major detractor, but it's something I thought that was worth mentioning. All things considered, I would rate Mao's Great Famine a low 7 out of 10. It's definitely a difficult read, and I don't just mean that because of the brutal subject matter. I'm talking mostly about the way that the information is presented, with Frank Dikötter being very rapid fire in the way he just hits you with one anecdote and statistic after another. It sometimes makes the information a bit hard to parse, but overall, I'm really happy I picked this book up. It was really informative and engaging to read. And I know that Frank Dikötter is often criticized by historians for his methodology and his conclusions, so if I do read more in Communist China, and I do want to, I'll try different authors to sort of give myself a broader understanding. If you know of anyone else who's written on this subject, please let me know. I'd be interested in the recommendations. But that'll have to wait, I guess, because I'm thinking of shifting away from nonfic for a while and just focusing on novels for a bit. So who knows what wacky book I'm going to decide to review next. But anyway, please consider subscribing if you're curious to see what wacky book I'll review next. And until next time, I guess. Goodbye!